I call the member for Sandgate.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
Order. The quarrelling will cease. What's the clock?
I
call the member for Sandgate.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on the Minister's amendment and acknowledge next week's marks the 22nd anniversary of the Queensland recognition statement made by then Premier Beattie, and that statement recognises Australian South Sea Islander people as a distinct cultural group, and that it received bipartisan support at the time. In fact, I participated in the events that occurred at the time 22 years ago with a number of other people who were passionate supporters of the recognition of Australian South Sea Islanders. And I also want to acknowledge that in 2020, as Multicultural Affairs Minister, I joined the Premier to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Australian South Sea Islander community being formally recognised as that distinct cultural group here in Queensland policy. And I want to acknowledge that the member for Morani was part of that recognition, part of that celebration a couple of years ago, and there are other colleagues in the Parliament, including the former Leader of the Opposition. We there came together and worked and had an opportunity for great reflection and celebration with the Australian South Sea Islander community. Now, the reality is, Mr Deputy Speaker, that these acknowledgements don't erase the harm that was done to South Sea Islanders in the 19th and early 20th century, and the continued impact of discrimination and the result of those acts in the decades since. But they are crucial moments in righting those historical wrongs. They're the right steps, and we've heard further from the Minister about the other steps that we're taking in supporting QASIC to be that voice, a genuine holistic voice for the whole of what has been a disrupted and dismembered community, a challenged community as a consequence of its discrimination. And government empowering the community to have its own voice is a better way than having this group here in this chamber make the decision. Let's work with the groups. It's our responsibility as a government to keep all of those wrongs fresh in our mind and keep the recognition fresh in our minds as we ensure that it remains something that's important. We continue to value the role and contribution of the South Sea Islander community here in Queensland. Our Australian South Sea Islander people came to this country mostly as blackbirded indentured labourers to toil specifically in the sugar and cotton industries from the 1860s to the early 1900s. And I want to acknowledge that the first group arrived and was set to labour in Logan Village. So this is a whole of Queensland thing. And I know there's a lot of areas in North Queensland that have a continued community, and that's very important and very important contribution to the nature of those communities. But it's a whole of Queensland story. And they came from the proud and culturally rich regions of the South Pacific, such as what we now know of as the Solomon Islands, New Caledonia, Vanuatu, and indeed islands of Kiribati and PNG. Here, however, they lived in hardship and faced awful, not just discrimination, but awful degradation. And they did so as a result of decisions made by this place without consultation with those people. In the Polynesian Labourers Act 1868. We need to make sure that when we enact decisions going forward that it's in consultation with the community that it will affect. And that's what QASIC provides the support for. Historically, it's very important to appreciate, Deputy Speaker, that the success of agriculture, indeed the success of industry globally, has been amassed, and huge amounts of wealth globally have been amassed off the back of unpaid labour. That's a global phenomenon. And the Australian South Sea Islander experience is the local Queensland example of that global injustice. So it's a global injustice we need to be conscious of in everything that we do. And all the industries that are the beneficiaries of that should be conscious and responsive to that globally. These are things that we need to be conscious of and be focused on being responsive globally. But I want to highlight that I'd like to see, and I want to congratulate, as he always does, the member from Ranny for being an advocate in this space, but I would love to see his political party recognise that this is a global issue of injustice to many peoples across the globe. I commend the amendment to the House.
Mr.